This period in American history is a fascinating one. It's something that I studied at university in Exeter in England, and it's a period that I find fascinating. And I think what is so interesting about this period is that the things that we are seeing today in America, issues, particularly the social issues around the women's rights, for example, or most obviously in recent times, race relations, all of these points are still absolutely fundamental and relevant to our world today, and obviously particularly in the United States. So first of all, I'd like to pass it over to you. This first lesson, we're just going to have a quick intro into the period. I'd just like to get a little bit from you, if possible, as to either, as I say, via the chat, or put your hand up on the Zoom and say what you'd like to say. Just a little bit of brainstorming on this period. So a little bit over to you. Anything you know about the 1920s at all. As I wrote in the description for the course, there's absolutely no need for any prior knowledge, but anything that you might know at all will help us along the way. So I'm just going to bring up some bullet points for you to think about, and anything that comes to mind, then please do share it with us. So the first point is this idea of prosperity and depression. Obviously, we're talking more about economic prosperity and economic depression here. Have a look at this photograph, for example, a classic image from the 1920s. Does this bring anything to mind? What can we see in this particular picture? What can we see in the background? What can we see underneath? Does it give us any ideas about this sort of period? Any ideas at all? We can't hear the audio. You can't hear me. Is that a problem? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, the audio is fine. The audio
is fine.
Yeah, maybe it's Fiorella.
Okay.
Incorrect.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so this first idea, absolutely. This idea of segregation, racial divide, we can see that this idea of this advert behind this world's highest standard of living, this is the American way, is brilliantly juxtapositioned with this image of these mainly African-American faces queuing for food underneath the image. Quite a powerful one. So we do have this incredible period of prosperity in the United States at this time, famous for so many things: jazz, prohibition, the Charleston voting rights. Absolutely, all of these things are absolutely fundamental. If we have a look at the next point, popular culture, Antonella, one or two of the things that you've just mentioned here are fundamental here. Does anybody know the relevance of this image? What is this film? Has anybody ever heard of this, or anybody seen it? Do anybody know why this is particularly significant? It was the first of something. Anyone know? Exactly, the first spoken film, precisely, and it gave birth to, Eleonora, as you say, the first spoken film, absolutely, and it gives birth to Hollywood, and that's what we now recognize as being Hollywood and the film industry in California. So it's incredibly important. And as Antonella, you mentioned before, the Charleston, yes, here we have the famous flappers, as they were known, the women wearing their famous 1920s iconic fashion there, dancing to the jazz music. Alcohol, organized crime. Alcohol, as Antonella has already mentioned, obviously there was prohibition. Prohibition, one of my favorite images from the 1920s. The Women's Temperance League, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Yes, amazing, absolutely fantastic image. Linking, obviously, to our organized crime, who is this lovely looking creature here? Anybody know? Exactly, he is indeed Al Capone, yes, the crime boss of Chicago, made famous more recently in the 1990s with Robert De Niro's portrayal in a fantastic film, The Untouchables. So, final question, final point as this part of the introduction is, how did the decade end? Obviously, we have Black Tuesday, the Wall Street crash of 1929. Easy to remember in terms of the date, Tuesday, the 29th of October, 1929. And it is absolutely, obviously catastrophic for the American economy. And obviously its effects were part of the reason, not the only reason, for the Great Depression that followed, which obviously spread out across the world and was felt perhaps even more severely in other countries around the world. Obviously, we have very, very high unemployment, and thousands of millions of previously well-paid and distinguished workers often suddenly finding themselves with no job and no prospect of work. So, what we're going to focus on now, key question here is this. Why was there an economic boom in the 1920s in America? So what we're going to look at now, and I promise it will become less economic in nature, but unfortunately, in order for us to start, we need to sort of set the foundations as to what gave America this fantastic prosperity. We will then move on to have a look at the other side of the argument and see who didn't benefit from this economic prosperity. And then we'll focus a little bit more on those social changes that we mentioned at the beginning. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at, in total, 7 reasons for the economic boom that allows America to experience this incredible economic growth. As again, please do stop me, do pause me, either by raising the hand or writing in the chat should you need any clarification of anything at all, or any questions of any sort, no problem. So the first point is this, the effects of World War I. Now, quick question, again, hopefully from general knowledge. Anybody have any idea or know when America actually entered World War I? Vaguely or precisely, it doesn't really matter. Anybody have any ideas? Well done, absolutely spot on, Eleonora. Yes, 1917. So obviously Europe had already been fighting for 3 years and America joined a little bit late on. We're not going to have a look at the reasons why America joined World War I, as that would take up a little bit too much time. However, let's just have a look at what this meant for the United States. So obviously, European economies were completely exhausted by the cost of war from 1914 until 1918. In comparison to that, America grew richer during the war. Now, the obvious reason for that is that America was mainly exporting. America was the provider for so many aspects of the war in Europe, obviously, and most obviously the arms, yes, but also food and the farming industry, as we will talk about in another lesson. The farming industry really experienced their economic boom during this period, during World War I, for obvious reasons. They were providing food not only for America, but also for large parts of Europe as well. So America was exporting, they were producing arms in mass production, and it was incredibly effective. As we've mentioned before, this was due obviously to the late arrival into the war, 1917. The second obvious reason is that America was obviously not affected, physically speaking, by the war. Their cities, their industries were not bombed, unlike large areas of countries such as Belgium and France, obviously, were devastated by the war. Here we have a photograph of Ypres in Belgium, which you can see is totally and utterly destroyed. So America obviously didn't have that to contend with. It also therefore meant that America could capitalize on weak European markets and dominate global markets. So, quick question. What, before 1917 and America entered the war, what was America's position, official position in the war? Were they more on one side or on the other side, or what did they say? What was their official point of view? Yeah, isolationism to a certain extent, but also neutrality. They claimed to be completely neutral in the war, not favoring one side or the other. Well, let's investigate that just for a moment. How neutral were they genuinely? Well, in terms of loans and investment, in terms of arms and food and various other things, to the Allies, being obviously Great Britain, France, etc., they gave them a loan or totaling loans of around about $2.7 billion. $2.7 billion, which for 1917 to 1919 money is quite extraordinary during First World War anyway. To the Central Powers, i.e. Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc., $27 million. So here we are not dealing with neutrality, okay? And so therefore, the reality of the situation was that $2.7 billion needed to be paid back to America, and America was not going to forget about these sorts of loans. And so what they did was that countries such as Great Britain, etc., they allowed and they gave America access to markets that they had previously not had access to, such as places, areas in China and the Far East, and even into areas of the Middle East. America suddenly had access to these areas in a way of these allies paying back. So the second idea here is raw materials. In very obviously simple terms, the great empires of the world, if we can call it that, the likes of Great Britain from the beginning of mainly really the Victorian age particularly, through to the beginning of the 20th century, why did they really have an empire? Yes, it was for global influence, etc., but part of it was simply a search for raw materials that they did not have. Great Britain had a huge amount of coal, but as the technology began to change and obviously things like oil became much more important, these countries didn't really have access to those raw materials. America did. America had it within its own borders. Places obviously such as Texas and California, areas such as that, and the Appalachian Mountains, for example, in the East Coast, which are essentially made of coal, America had a huge amount of these raw materials. What's the big advantage of that? Lovely photograph here of health and safety in the United States not really being particularly important with oil drills next to your summer destination. But obviously, these things did not need to be imported, and therefore they were much cheaper to produce, and they could be turned into products, etc. Here we have just a quick graph, we don't need to go into too much detail, that shows the price of coal in the United States was incredibly low compared to other countries, and it remained fundamentally stable over the period, even if America's economic growth was incredibly quick. The third reason is mass production. What can we see there in the back of the slide there? What can we see in the photograph? Any ideas where that might be? Yeah, pretty much it's Ford. Okay, absolutely. So it's the Ford factory, all right? And so America had already, as we had already mentioned, okay, they had had these huge technological advances in industrial production. Obviously, Great Britain had had their industrial revolution, was still arguably having their industrial revolution, and their production had been, productive techniques had been incredible. However, what we have in America is one big advantage. They have these factories which become automated, less people needed, more production possible. And obviously, as we know, this means that they are able to produce huge amounts of goods at incredibly low prices, thanks to also, as we've just mentioned, having so many raw materials available to them as well. And as the products began to change, here obviously in the photograph, we can see a factory producing electric fans. As these sort of consumer goods became more popular, it became even more fundamental that they had these incredible techniques. So what did this mean? Well, one result of this was obviously that the products that they were able to do, the consumer price index was incredibly, we saw an incredible rise. And then through the 1920s, during the war, obviously, and then through the 1920s, this began to fall, even though the price and the standard of living was going up so much. So, as we mentioned, following that model of Henry Ford, this mass production allowed the US economy to grow by an incredible 50%. In the 1920s. Over a 9-year period, they experienced an economic growth of 50%. Just to put that into some context, at the end of the 1990s, the mid-90s to the end of the 1990s, America experienced another economic boom where obviously it was based mainly on the internet industries, etc., other aspects, but still, on average, the growth per year at its absolute height in the 1990s was around about 4%. So that gives us an idea that over 9 years for an economy to grow by 50% is absolutely extraordinary. However, how was that? And obviously, sorry, here we have the classic production line in a Ford factory here, producing those incredible cars at very, very, very low prices. So here we have a map of the GDP, the gross domestic product, PIL, as I believe it is in Italian, the amount of money generated. And we can see that throughout the 1920s, there is an extraordinary growth up to 1929, where we have obviously this large drop off up until 1933, where there is a certain amount of recovery, thanks mainly to the New Deal and Franklin D. Roosevelt. But that growth really is something quite incredible. So how were the consumers able to do that? It's one thing being able to make all of these products, but you need to be able to sell them. You need to be able to give people the opportunity to actually buy them. And so many companies, and it became incredibly common to have this idea called hire purchase. Now, hire purchase perhaps is more clearly shown by the slogan, buy now, pay later. Yes, something that we are all incredibly familiar with today. We buy our cars and our mobile phones, usually on contract. We give our down payment and piece by piece, we slowly pay it back. Well, this obviously was already in place to a certain extent, but it became so widespread that absolutely every company across the United States was doing it. Here we can see a photograph even of buying tires on credit. So it was incredibly widespread, and it allowed consumers to be able to buy so many of these new products. As a result, you have more of these consumer products, these consumer goods, which before the 1920s, obviously, firstly, were not very common, but really were only available to the super rich, really became absolutely available to everybody. Here are some of the products. What can we see in this picture? What can we see over here? Anyone? What have we got over here? Any of these images, what can we see? Absolutely. You've got telephones. Okay, so people began to be connected. Now, as simple as that may seem, think about the impact that this is having. People being able to connect. The country begins to be connected together. What about down here and over here to a certain extent? Sorry, up here in the top left-hand corner. What have we got? Examples of the... Absolutely, Antonella. Yes, the radio. Okay, so you've got the little one down here, the almost portable radio versus the kind of the one for your house up here. Yes, the phonogram, absolutely. The amazing record player, which obviously leads to a cultural revolution in allowing the fantastic jazz music we were listening to at the beginning of the presentation before we started to get out to the masses and people to be able to have that music in their own homes. What about this one? This one's a little bit stranger. Can anybody see what that is? It's a little bit of a strange one to understand what it is. It's actually a fridge. It's actually a fridge, a refrigerator, right? So one of the first refrigerators. So you begin to get all of these consumer products, which is just such a revolution for so many people's homes. And also television. Now, television obviously doesn't really come along until much later in huge numbers for the American population, but it is coming. It is coming at the end of the 1920s. So American consumerism, a consumer society, is born, and these consumer goods become a sign of your social status. Often, as the decade continued and many people around the country became richer and richer, you know, it wasn't a case of, oh, I've got one car, wow, I can actually afford to have two cars. And they're not just American cars. Maybe I've got a European car, and we'll come on to why a European car was often one of the biggest social status symbols. We'll come on to that shortly. So here is one example, however, of perhaps where people might have been able to guess that there was a bit of a problem coming. Have a look at this. This is General Motors. Some of you may be familiar with what General Motors was and is to a certain extent. You've got the biggest names in American manufacturing, car manufacturing. You've got Buick and Cadillac and Chevrolet, etc., GMC trucks. This company was the biggest car company in the world by quite a distance. And in 1910, 39,300 cars sold. By 1924, 14 years later, it's almost 600,000 cars in America. By the time we get to 1925, just to put that into some kind of context for you, at its absolute peak, companies such as Ford were producing a new car every 25 seconds, which is quite extraordinary. They estimate, and this again is a real kind of, you know, one of these facts that you can take with, as we might say in English, with a pinch of salt. Yes, whether you believe it completely or not, but they believe, historians believe, that at its peak, you could actually fit the entire American population into the cars that there were on the road. Obviously 4 or 5 people per car, but quite an extraordinary growth in the popularity of the motor car during this period. But however, as we mentioned, the majority of these things were not bought outright. People didn't pay for the whole thing. They bought them on credit. So at this point, the amount of credit granted by General Motors by 1925 was $810 million, which is, by 1925 standards, an extraordinary amount of money. So what does that mean? Well, as many of you have probably already guessed, it meant that generally at this stage, people weren't really worried because they were making money, they could maintain their payments. However, it led to some doubts beginning to creep in. There was a newspaper headline here, which extraordinarily, if you have a look at the date, October the 22nd, 1929, exactly 7 days before the Wall Street crash, stock market invincible. There was so many people, to a certain extent, I'm afraid to say, completely deluded by the invincibility of the American market. The reality of the situation was, as we've just mentioned, so many of those products were simply bought on credit. And as a result, American consumer debt was rising to astronomical levels for the time. And that, unless it is dealt with by the government, is really only going to lead to disaster, as we will, of course, see. All right. So how is all of this possible? How is this able to possible? You can have mass production, you can have raw materials, you can have hire purchase, etc. But unless you have a government in place that allows these things to happen, then it is extremely difficult. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the phrase laissez-faire, the idea of allowing an economy to simply generate wealth. The Republican presidents of the 1920s, who we will briefly talk about, perhaps next lesson, were huge exponents, of this idea. They interfered as little as possible with the economy. Go out, they said to big business, go out, make money, make money. Here are the three men who are responsible, if you like. We've got Harding, Coolidge, and poor old Herbert Hoover, who was president during the Wall Street crash. Now, quick general question. If you ask Americans, or from your own general knowledge, if you ask for a list of the top 3 American presidents of all time, who usually appears on that list? Any ideas? Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Antonella. Lincoln, definitely. Anybody else? Good, absolutely, yeah. Roosevelt, Franklin D. Sometimes Theodore as well, a great personal favorite of mine, fantastic president. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, JFK, okay, yes. And we can perhaps add the likes of, obviously, George Washington and 1 or 2 others to the list. You'll notice that, unfortunately, none of these guys appear on the list. In fact, Herbert Hoover, bless him, often appears absolutely in last position. Poor lad, had a terrible time. Harding wasn't much better. Coolidge, in that boom period in the middle, was enjoyed perhaps a little bit more success, but there we are. So we don't know a huge amount, or we don't need to know a huge amount about those presidents, but we will talk a little bit about what their role in all of this was a little bit. So as we mentioned, their idea, their belief was business, go out, create wealth, create money. Coolidge particularly giving American business a huge amount of support. How did they do it? Well, they did it really in 2 key ways, right? By keeping taxes low. First of all, more money for business to invest. You keep corporate taxes low. More companies can therefore invest in different markets, producing more products, etc., etc. Secondly, if you keep income tax low as well, obviously the consumer has more money in their pocket. Obviously, we've mentioned that a lot of these products became cheaper and cheaper. There was more availability for credit on a huge range of different products. And so people had more and more money in their pockets. In addition, obviously, wages were increasing for many people around the country. Not all people, and we'll definitely come to that later on. So here we can see in this little graph the general growth of GDP that we have here, compared to how low the taxes remained throughout this period, 1925, when Coolidge was there, particularly low. Generally speaking, economic historians argue that for the progress that they had made and the economic prosperity to spread to more and more of the population, it would be necessary for these taxes to be increased at a relative rate to GDP to allow more investment for the government and to try to combat any crises that may come up. So allowing and having a government that allows you to pursue these policies was incredibly important. One of these policies was tariff policies. Now, tariff policies are incredibly important in this period, and we'll talk just briefly a little bit about some of those. Now, Republican presidents imposed huge taxes, very, very high taxes on imports coming from abroad. So if we think about that for a moment. What would be the purpose? Here we have the actual names of these tariffs, etc. Don't worry too much about the names themselves, but we can see that from the beginning of the 1920s, it begins to rise astronomically speaking. At the beginning of the 1920s, it was around about 40% in terms of these import prices. And by the time we get to the end of the decade, actually, ironically, after the Wall Street crash, which is one of the reasons why poor old Herbert Hoover is not considered very highly, it got to almost 70%. So putting that in simple terms, if you are buying a car, you go out to buy your car and you have a choice between either buying your Ford car or an equivalent car, which could be, for example, your Chevrolet or something similar, or Ford, or sorry, a European car such as a Citroen or something like that. Your equivalent European car would be up to 60, 70% more expensive. So obvious result in that is that people bought American. Okay, foreign goods were more expensive. American consumers bought American products. Hence the fact, as I mentioned before, those buying a European car simply because it costs so much more than the American equivalent was kind of the ultimate status symbol. One photograph that I will show you when we are talking about the Wall Street crash is a fantastic photograph of a man on Wall Street, a banker, selling his Rolls Royce, his British-made Rolls Royce, for $100 in complete and utter desperation. So those European cars, as I mentioned, became a real kind of status symbol. But in a more kind of general market for the whole of America, American consumers bought American products, Cadillacs, Buicks, Chevrolets, Pontiacs, etc. However, that's all well and good, okay? You can produce as many products as you want, you can give people the opportunity to buy them, but fundamentally our last point, reason number 7, is you need to be able to persuade people to buy them, okay? So there was an explosion in mass advertising in the 1920s. The businesses were using new techniques, or relatively new techniques, that were kind of based really on the wartime propaganda posters. We can see a few examples of them here. And those propaganda posters obviously persuading men to go to war and women to work at home and people to join the Navy, etc. They became the basis of the advertising campaigns of the 1920s. So these consumers were bombarded by advertising everywhere. Obviously, as we've mentioned, this consumerism and these new consumer products, telephones, people beginning to have telephones in their house, so calling up, selling in those ways. People having radios, advertising on radio stations directly into people's homes was something completely new. Mass and national advertising on new radios, newspapers, magazines. There were also things such as celebrity endorsements. Here we have a fantastic idea. Obviously, does anybody have any idea who Babe Ruth was at the time? Has anyone heard that name before? I mean, it's fairly obvious from the picture. Obviously, he is I think it was the New York Yankees. Yes, the Yankees, one of the most famous baseball players of all time. But he became a celebrity endorser, in this case for Red Rock Cola. But it was widespread, this idea of having celebrities advertising your products. And one of my favorite adverts from this period, I love the precision of this. Look at this. It says, advert for Lucky Strike cigarettes, 20,679 physicians. I love the precision. Say Luckies are less irritating. It's toasted. And the idea of slogans coming up. Now, I don't know if anybody is familiar with how tobacco is produced, but it's all toasted. No matter of the brand, it doesn't matter. But to have this slogan, Lucky Strike, it's toasted, almost sound like it was pleasant, it was good for you. And all of this fantastic advertising, or perhaps in terms of health, not such fantastic advertising, was born in the 1920s and became incredibly important. So we have mass advertising. Things such as mail order catalogs, the Amazon, if you like, of the day, where catalogs would simply arrive at your house, you mailed off the little list having chosen your products, and your products arrived in your home. Imagine the ability to be able to go out and not to have to go out, and to have suddenly all of these consumer products delivered to your house. It must have been pretty revolutionary for so many people. So there we have the 7, in my opinion, principal reasons for the economic boom. I'll just shut up for a second. Are there any doubts, any questions, or anything that anybody would like to add at this stage? If not, what I would say, okay, so did anyone see the crash coming? Eduardo, you have asked. Well, it's an interesting question. The incredible answer to that question is no, not really. Now, obviously, there were people who predicted the crash coming, economists who did see the dangers, particularly of huge consumer debt, which was being accumulated. But what happened was that people tended to either think that it was not going to be a serious, drop or change, and so people just simply didn't really, people tended to sort of ignore any warnings that there were. But generally speaking, these warnings were not listened to. They were fairly widely ignored. The interesting point is, as we will come on to a little bit more next time, was the simple fact that the reality of the situation is who actually experienced and shared this prosperity. And the answer to that question, as I say, we'll speak a little bit more about next time. But basically, the image that the world had of the 1920s, an image that endures today, the image of, champagne flowing and the 1920s fashion and style, the swinging clubs and the prosperity that everybody was experiencing, that was not the majority of the population. The majority of the population did not share in that prosperity, and that becomes something that is sort of, if you like, an undercurrent to the emerging crisis that happens at the end of the 1920s and into the beginning of the 1930s. So what we'll do is we'll just briefly have a quick look at the for the remaining few minutes, and then, as I say, I'll leave it open again for anybody else to come up with any other questions you might have. And that is a little brief look at the 3 men, at the 3 presidents. Okay, so President Warren Harding, first of all. So he won the 1920 election with a motto of a return to normalcy. Normalcy being isolationism, to get out of the destructive war that had happened in Europe. Even if America had only been involved for 1 year, they had still lost 50,000 odd soldiers. And as a result, the war was not a popular thing, as you might imagine, for many Americans. And so the idea was, leave Europe to its own problems. We do not want to get involved. And therefore, after Woodrow Wilson had taken America in, Harding won the election with the promise of taking America out. So this was a famous quotation that allowed him to win this election. America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration, not surgery, but serenity. We don't need great changes. We need to focus on our own issues, our own problems. We need to solve our own domestic issues, which arguably, well, he was not exactly famous for achieving, perhaps. He had his presidency was marred by scandals. He had many problems, mainly in his own private lives. Known for gambling, once gambled a set of White House china, as you can see here. He had an affair with many women outside of marriage, and wasn't exactly particularly well regarded. One thing that he did have a lasting effect on was this idea that he is credited, as it says here, with coming up with the term founding fathers. So the idea of the original likes of Jefferson and Washington, etc., as the founding fathers of the United States. One example of this scandal was the Teapot Dome scandal, which was essentially an area in Wyoming, a huge government oil field, and the government would put out the contracts and say, okay, you present your offer to all the various large oil businesses and say, okay, so you give me your offer as to how you are going to put this contract and put this project together, and we will decide who will win that contract. And it was found that he'd actually accepted a huge amount of bribes from some of these businessmen, and as a result was not exactly, didn't exactly have a very successful presidency. The second president, Harding, actually died while in office. Coolidge took over, as you can see, in 1923, a year before perhaps he should have done, or at least Harding's first term would have ended. And Calvin Coolidge, kind of the symbol, if you like, of this period, took over after Harding's death, very committed to big business and expanding. Now this, if this isn't, you know, the perfect example of American 1920s advertising, I absolutely love it. Keep cool with Coolidge. The idea that this is, you know, if you took away the photograph for a moment of Coolidge, you know, it almost sounds like a, I don't know, a fridge advert, or for a, you know, a cool drink or something similar. Sponsored by Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor Restaurants. Just fantastic. A great kind of microcosm, if you like, for a representation of the 1920s in one little campaign poster. So Calvin Coolidge, the second president, laissez-faire approach to the economy, as we've already mentioned, and the period of his economic policies were known as Coolidge prosperity. The huge economic growth of the 1920s, the laissez-faire policies of allowing business to go out and create business and do what they wanted to do. The economy improved astronomically during his presidency. However, as we will see, and as we have to a certain extent already seen, was it based on reality, or was it based particularly on perhaps the accumulating debt of so many Americans? Don't worry too much about remembering exactly what this is, but this Kellogg-Briand Pact, is something that, again, kind of symbolizes the positive outlook that many Americans had at this time. So this was a pact that was passed in 1928, towards the end of Coolidge's presidency. And it is an agreement among nations to outlaw war, except in self-defense. a little bit of a rather large asterisk, except in self-defense, but we'll come to that in a moment. Nations agree to settle disputes through peaceful means and not through war. In theory, it outlawed war. It made war illegal. And in reality, that pact is still in place today. Now, looking at America's last 70 or 80 or to 100 years worth of history, I think we can agree that perhaps it hasn't been free of war. So it's not really particularly important as a policy, as an actual agreement, but it symbolizes that kind of incredible optimism that people had during this period of the 1920s. And as I mentioned, the final part, just to add to the last point, there was no way to enforce the pact. There was no genuine way of actually making sure how people could actually outlaw war. So it was a fairly, as I say, symbolic pact. Finally, Mr. Hoover, as we have mentioned, poor old Herbert Hoover. There's one thing in America, I don't know if anybody can know this answer, there is one thing in America, a structure, a fundamental structure, which is named after Herbert Hoover. Does anybody know what that is in the United States? One huge structure. Anyone know what that's called? Not the FBI, it certainly was born around about that time. It's actually a physical structure and is called the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam. And the Hoover Dam is one of the largest, dam is digger, yes, the large structures to stop the flow of rivers. The Hoover Dam was one of the largest structures, which was given its name not by Herbert Hoover, but actually by Franklin D. Roosevelt as a kind of a rather belated, nod to saying, he wasn't so bad in the beginning of his presidency in 1932. So the Hoover Dam is what it was. But poor old Herbert Hoover had a bit of a nightmare. The reason why he had such a nightmare, he promised to help poverty and the unequal distribution of wealth in America. The unequal distribution of wealth, which, as we will see next lesson, becomes the fundamental reason for this economic disparity, this economic crash, not so much the Wall Street crash itself, but more the depression that follows. And the unequal distribution of wealth was vast in America, as we will see. Again, obviously, a laissez-faire government. And his main policy was this: help people help themselves. Now, if any of you or anybody you know has been unemployed, one of the worst things that somebody can come up to you and say is, help yourself, work a little bit harder, take a little bit less money, and we'll look after you. Well, that was Herbert Hoover's approach, the kind of laissez-faire, you get out, we work harder, and we can get out of this economic crisis. The problem was for Herbert Hoover is that a lot of the policies that he came up with between 29 and 33 were simply massively ineffective. They were too small. The actual ideas that he had often weren't terrible. Now, I'll give you a small example of that. One of the ideas that he had was that if you invest as the government in rebuilding infrastructure, and the example being the dam that became the Hoover Dam, you build those things, you build bridges, you build roads, etc., you will actually begin to get people back to work. There'll be government invested, and the government will then obviously begin to win back some of that money through taxes when people begin to work. The problem was his programs were too small. They were too small scale. It wasn't until Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt came along in 32 that those projects became enormous, under obviously the famous New Deal. So Herbert Hoover was incredibly unpopular, mainly because the poor chap was very very, very uncharismatic. His speeches that he gave were incredibly boring. He never smiled. He was very, very dull man. Not to kick a man when he's down, but there we are. And compared to who came after, being Franklin D. Roosevelt, he really did seem not much more than talking to a fridge door, let's be honest. So, poor man didn't exactly have very effective solutions to the Great Depression, particularly that followed at the beginning of the 1930s. So, those were our presidents. This is what he said towards the end of the decade. Economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. Well, that was his theory, that was his idea. His idea, as we saw a little bit, remember, if some of you remember, I mentioned when the tariff policies went so high, one of his reactions to the Wall Street crash was actually not to reduce tariffs and allow global trade to begin to restart again. He actually increased tariffs. He increased tariffs and thought, well, one of the big problems is that people are not buying American products. Well, that wasn't the problem. Okay, obviously the problem was much wider than that. So we have this problem, this idea that the government couldn't solve the problem. Well, guess what? Roosevelt comes along and proves everybody otherwise. And so, unsurprisingly, Herbert Hoover left office as a very, very unpopular president, often, as I said, coming very bottom of the list of the greatest presidents, or a list of American presidents of all time. So I'll just very briefly, before we finish, introduce the next key question, the next idea. And that is very simply, did all Americans benefit from the economic boom? And as I've already hinted, perhaps the answer, of course, is no. No, 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 and no again. And we will briefly have a look at some of those reasons at the beginning of next time.